Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Michael Beschloss and Andrea Mitchell. As they say in my former business, Andrea, I yield to the gentlewoman from the world.
I just want to say that film was extraordinary. It's such a deserved tribute to everyone who put it together, everyone at the National Archives. Thank you, Governor Blanchard, for your, well, two fine words, but too many fine words about me, because we're honoring Michael and to Secretary Slater and Aurelia, my great old friend from NBC days before she was at ABC, David Ferrero. It's wonderful to be with you. And of course, with Bill Webster and Linda Webster and all my friends. Little known fact about Alan Greenspan and Bill Webster is that they were tennis partners. They had to create a new category at the tennis club in the tournament for 80-plus competitors in the doubles tournament, and they share the same birthday.
And both really good.
And they were both great. So, well, Michael, this is your night, and I just want to share. I was going to start by asking Michael, how did you become an historian? Well, I think we know from the letter of 8-year-old Michael Beschloss. Well, we received an email which starts, "Dear friend, saw Peter Baker's tweet this morning," of course, the chief Washington correspondent, White House correspondent for the New York Times, "and wanted to offer Dad's and my warmest congratulations on your honor this evening. No one is more deserving. Your Miss Brahm is no doubt quietly smiling and so proud of her young charge. Never forget the imprint you made upon her, too. With congratulations and the greatest affection, Chris," who is the son of?
Chris is the daughter of my first grade teacher.
Okay, it's a female Chris.
Miss Bram was her mother. She became Mrs. Condon before she was born. And she invited the whole first grade class to her wedding, Infant Jesus of Prague, Flossmoor, Illinois. And the other thing that, people wonder what teachers do they don't do this anymore. I was in the first grade. They had me skip kindergarten, so I was 4 years old. So I was in that class with 6-year-olds who were probably, 5 inches taller than I was. I was not the first to be chosen for teams on the playground. But her mother made sure that I was always treated respectfully and nicely and had a great year and lots of friends. And so her mother died early, but Chris, as you can see, I'm still in touch with. So thank you for reading that, Andrea.
Well,
We've all had teachers like that, I'm sure.
that just tells you about the early education and the imprint that a wonderful teacher can make on any child. And I'm wondering, how long ago did you first start working? Not just the foundation, but you've done so much research.
Well, when I was growing up, if I had known about an evening like this would have been like Woodstock for me. Thank you all for being here. I may not look like Jimi Hendrix, but I feel like him tonight. Forgive the historical reference. But I wanted to do this pretty much since I was about 10 years old. It was the time of the Civil War centennial, and also something that I think Jim and David and Patrick and Rodney have all said, and Aurelia, which is that if you were growing up in the early 1960s, presidents seemed pretty important to you. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was 60 years ago this week. I was growing up outside of Chicago, and it was explained to me by my parents how dangerous this was. And I said, is this like a tornado? Because 3 or 4 times a summer, we'd go down into the cellar and maybe come up and the house wasn't there. That never happened to us, but sometimes did happen. Or I remember being in summer camp in northern Wisconsin when Johnson became president, my great friend over here, LBJ. And it always looked, this is so caricaturing. I hope you don't mind this. But it's true, and it doesn't reflect that well on me. I was the only kid in the summer camp with a subscription to the air edition of the Chicago Tribune in Northern. So came 2 days late in those days. For the younger people, there was no internet version at the time. And they kept on having what I thought was like the same photograph on the cover, on the front page of the Chicago Tribune day after day. And this was the summer of '65, LBJ signing all these pieces of legislation. It looked like with the same people. And I loved the fact that I got to see one of those bills being signed, one of the bills that was signed upstairs. And Patrick and David and all of your colleagues, they did not know that that connected directly to my life as a 9-year-old, but it really did, and I loved it.
Which brings me to why you think the National Archives are so important to us, to our history, to our culture, to our society.
Well, I mean, this is almost a religious experience for me, because I think in America, if you go back to the founders, you know, we know a lot about them, but there's one thing that I think is less well known, and that is that we all know that they wanted to develop a political system that would be different from the one in England. But one of the ways they wanted it to be different was, if you were in England or if you were another monarchy, you wouldn't be seeing the king's documents, especially if the king made mistakes or the queen. So the result was that they felt that those societies did not learn from the mistakes of its leaders. And so they didn't have a National Archives here until FDR in the 1930s. But their idea was that it was the highest form of patriotism to preserve our documents, beginning with the records of the Constitutional Convention, some of which took a long time to come out. But the idea was that they would be preserved even if they embarrassed the leaders, even if they embarrassed American citizens who had made the bad decisions, because their whole thing was the only way a society really progresses is if you know what were mistakes and what were successes, and you benefit from both. So our founders did not know that there would be a National Archives, and it is astounding that it took until the 1930s for this institution to exist. But, you know, everyone always says if the founders were here, this is what they would think. I can't tell you what they would think, but I would speculate. They would like the fact that we have an institution that makes sure that records are preserved, make sure that they're available to people as soon as possible, both to understand our national story, but even more than that, to benefit from the mistakes and the successes as soon as possible. And I think we've seen that. Can I say another word? Since we're talking about the archives, can I tell about the first 2 times I was in an archives installation? I've had a privileged life in certain ways. I got to study at Don Byers in my alma mater, Williams College, Western Massachusetts, under James McGregor Burns, the great historian and political scientist, who I think, Don, was your teacher too, was he not? And certainly knew you, and he admired you very much. And so in any case, as was mentioned earlier, I wrote a thesis under his senior honors thesis at Williams on the relationship between Joe Kennedy and FDR. He had written on 2 Kennedys and also his famous work on Franklin Roosevelt. And so I had a privileged situation because, you know, you usually don't start at the top studying under one of the great scholars on earth, which I had the luck to do. So first thing I did was he sent me to the Kennedy Library. This must have been about 1975 or 6, which at that time, it was so early, the Kennedy Library, as we know it now, had not yet been built. There was a big argument with the city of Cambridge over whether it would be built near Harvard Square. People in Cambridge said, you know, they do this here, it's going to be horrible. You're going to have people from Nebraska, they said, with Winnebagos, which to people in Cambridge, that would be about the worst nightmare that they could think of, both Nebraska and the Winnebagos. So, but anyway, so at this point, Kennedy Library was still in a warehouse in Waltham, Massachusetts. So thanks to Jim, here I am, 20 years old. Do I start like everyone else, sitting in a room somewhere? No. He called up his friend David Powers. Everyone remember who Dave Powers was? President Kennedy's close friend and aide, by then was curator of the Kennedy Library. So at the beginning of my historical research career in the National Archives, I've got Dave Powers, of all people, showing me through the artifacts and archives of the Kennedy Library, to the point that he even had the rocking chair uncrated for me. So you can imagine, for someone who had written LBJ at the age of 8 saying, put JFK on Mount Rushmore, 13 years later to have Dave Powers opening in the crate and pulling out the chair to show me, if I was not headed for this career, by then I certainly was. One other snapshot and then I'll shut up, and that is that my second experience was in the LBJ library working on my senior thesis. It was Christmas 1977. First visit to the LBJ library. I walked in, it was a couple weeks before Christmas, I think. And the Hallelujah chorus was being played. And so I was saying to myself, is this because it's Christmas, or did LBJ leave in his will that the Hallelujah chorus always be played in the LBJ library in his memory? It turns out it was just for Christmas. So anyway, I began researching, doing research in the LBJ library. There's a wonderful archivist in the reading room, Nancy Keegan-Smith. And I said, hey, Nancy, I didn't come down here for this, but when I was 8, I sent this letter to LBJ saying that Kennedy should be carved on Mount Rushmore. I've got the reply from his secretary, Juanita Roberts, who wrote, she's on the green copy right here. Juanita says, the president has received your letter and thanks you for your suggestion for honoring President Kennedy. And so I took this down, letter from Mrs. Roberts, President's secretary, showed it to my friends at the hockey rink. They said, it's obviously a forgery. No president's secretary would bother with you. So anyway, I said, I'm sure my letter, at the age of 8, I was not in the habit of keeping copies of my outgoing mail. But, is there any chance, you might have a sack of children's mail from December 1963 or something like that. And so 5 minutes later, Nancy comes out of the back holding my letter, which you will see right here on the left. Looks a little bit yellowed right now. This was a little, many moons ago. But in any case, there I am at the age of 22, seeing what the National Archives and its brilliant people can do. And final thing, and then I'll stop with this story, is that Nancy went on to become an eminent figure in history and archives and the National Archives. And I invited her to dinner here tonight. Turns out October 19th is her birthday, but she was kind enough to come to the reception, and I got a picture taken with her, which I will always treasure.
This is full circle. Well, I think you just began to answer how you wrote your first book at the age of 24, Kennedy and Roosevelt, because you had done all this research already.
Yeah, and the way I always say, it was my college senior thesis, and it reads like it. I rewrote it considerably, but it shows you the excitement of doing original research. And again, I was lucky. I asked Steve Smith, who was President Kennedy's, or the Kennedy family's business manager and literary executor. There was a diary that, or actually a diplomatic memoir that Joe Kennedy had written about his years in London, was very eager to publish around 1960. John Kennedy was running for president. He was not eager to have his father's memoir published of the years of appeasement in London and his father's friendship with Chamberlain. A lot of these things were political problems for him. So the thing was never published, but in it, he had excerpts from his diaries, and Joe Kennedy talked to FDR all the time, and there were all sorts of excerpts from their conversations. So I got to see this. I think I was the first outsider to see this. And, I was sort of spoiled at the beginning. I thought that you write a book, you get to see always things like this, like Joe Kennedy's private diary that no one else had seen with all these things from FDR. But that's what is so exciting about original research, and that's what's so exciting about working alongside the people here of the National Archives, because they understand that excitement and they understand how important it is that they make sure that these documents are not only preserved, but you ask any of these great archivists who are in this building or College Park or any presidential library. For instance, I'm right now writing a book on race in the 20th century presidents. And I know that I can go into the Truman Library or the Roosevelt Library and say, FDR had this correspondence with this guy on the Democratic Party. Did they talk about civil rights? Is there anything there? Maybe the anti-lynching bill. And these archivists will know, and they will be just as excited as you are, and they'll say, we've got the most amazing letter that historians seem to ignore. And so thanks to the National Archives, we can do this kind of research all the time, and that's why it is as exciting a profession as it seems to be. Reminds me a little bit about an LBJ story. He once was listening to Kenneth Galbraith talk about economics, and I'll slightly clean this up, Johnson said, Ken, when you talk about economics, it's like peeing down your leg. He didn't say peeing. Peeing down your leg seems hot to you, but not to anybody else. So, I'm trying to show why historical research is exciting.
And your enthusiasm and the way you just absorb and search for original research is what makes you so incredibly successful and impactful as an historian. And the way you've translated it through social media, which was referenced as we saw in the film, but also on television. I'm a great beneficiary of that. Anytime that there's anything important going on. The first person I call, of course, is Michael Beschloss, and my producers all know that the first person I'm going to want to ask to come in the midst of his incredibly busy schedule and his own program and everything else that he's doing is Michael Beschloss.
And the producers are all saying, why did she always insist on putting that bore on our show?
But why, how text. And the other people who I happen to know love your context is presidents of the United States. Presidents of the United States who invite historians, small groups of historians, to off-the-record conversations, sometimes surprising. You've met with all of the presidents except
for Donald Trump, whom I have never met.
Who I suspect was less interested in the context, but in any case.
Haven't met him, so I don't know.
But you didn't have that experience.
Yeah.
But tell me about, you can't describe the exact conversations, but what is it about the people in the Oval Office, the people in that elevated position who really are so hungry for what you and John Meacham and others and your colleagues
and Doug
explain?
Brinkley, who's here. Where's Doug? Doug and I were at the Obama dinners. President Obama had a dinner for historians, maybe 5 times, Doug, maybe 6, especially the first term. And George H.W. Bush did, Bill Clinton did, George W. Bush did, and Joe Biden has done that now twice. And they all do it in their own way, and people on the outside sort of think, isn't this exciting? I think Doug will agree with this. You have dinner with President Obama, he must have told you all of his inner secrets, and what are they? And instead, what it is that these presidents, they're not doing this for show. They're in jobs where every hour of every day they've got people who are coming at them for decisions, in some cases with about a 60-minute time horizon. And every president I've mentioned has found it helpful to be prompted to think in larger terms. And they all do. And the subject of these meetings or dinners is always, they don't always say it, but you know what they want. Anything in history that the current period reminds you of. No one is there, I think Doug would agree, no one is there to give advice, but getting historians to shut up, as you can see right now, is not the easiest thing.
Thank goodness.
Right.
you know, it occurs to me, having covered presidents, and you know them far more intimately and study them in ways that I never could aspire to. Presidents are caricatured by people like me and my colleagues all the time. And
Not by you.
they are distressed by a lot of what is written about them, as
That
anyone
true.
is,
Well, it means you're doing your job.
as all of us are, by
Right.
things that are written about us. But I learned after the Reagan years, I had already realized it, that he was described in certain ways as not paying attention, not being a detail person. But I had the privilege of covering all of his arms control negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev, and knew how important his sense of history and his passion about disarmament.
Right.
And you know, you
Very,
remember,
very genuine.
and you remember when one of my colleagues asked him before Gorbachev became president, why haven't you met with any of these Soviet leaders?
They keep dying
And
on
he said,
me.
well, they keep dying on me because Andropov and Chernenko and Brezhnev, of course, had all died. And now we had a 50-something, 56-year-old Mikhail Gorbachev. And when I first realized, really profoundly, after I saw the letters that he had written by hand every night to Nancy, the relationship was, you know, storied relationship. The letters were in his hand. The published book was in his handwriting, with erasures and cross-outs and ink. And when I saw how eloquent and poetic they were, and all of the literary allusions, I realized that this was a man who loved literature and loved history, and was far greater intellect than anyone had ever told him to be,
All
or
true.
described him as.
And it tells you so much, you know this story, that after Reagan was shot and nearly killed, one of the first letters he wrote was by hand to Leonid Brezhnev saying, we've got to do something to get these nuclear arsenals under control. So you see what was close to his heart. Can I tell another story that's against myself?
Feel free.
I had
It's all off the record here.
Yes, all off the record. Washington is famous for observing strict off-the-record rules. But I got to have lunch with Richard Nixon in February of 1992, 2 years before he died. I was writing a book with Strobe Talbot on the end of the Cold War, and he had given a lot of advice to Reagan and Bush, so he was close to Strobe. So we went and had lunch at his house in New Jersey, which was in a development called Bear's Nest, which Nixon kept on referring to as Eagle's Nest. And I said, you know, maybe I shouldn't tell anyone that during his lifetime, which I did not. So anyway, this is the problem, and none of this speaks well for me. So we went up in the elevator, the door opened, and there was Nixon in his library at the top of this house, set of golf clubs. So I said, I was trying to be, you know, Nixon was a big figure in my early life, you know, as a child. Mr. President, I thought you had given up golf. He said, yes, ever since I had a hole-in-one. And I said, yes, wasn't that with Randolph Scott in 1961? And he gave me the strangest look, and I said to myself, just shut up. You know, it's too much. You know, you're not, he's going to find you so weird, he's not going to say a word. So I was almost mute for the drinks we had upstairs and for some of the lunch that we had downstairs in front of a very nice gas fireplace. And then I thought, you know, why the hell not? So I told a story my mother always told me, which I don't remember this, but she told it to me, which is that in the fall of 1960, when John Kennedy was running against Nixon, she said, I was taken to the side of a Richard Nixon motorcade. My parents were Republicans. And held up in the air as Nixon's Cadillac rolled by. And I don't remember it, but she told me that many times. So I said to Nixon, Mr. President, you may not remember me, but we have met before. You know, I was the 4-year-old held up in the air. And that was the year that Nixon was saying, elect me and your children will not grow up under communism. So I was a theater prop in a Dick Nixon motorcade as an example of a child who would not grow up under communism. And I did not, so that was a campaign promise kept that year. So I told this story, and I thought Nixon would be charmed, you know, his young admirer at the age of 4. He immediately changed the subject. And what he wanted to know was, what do we do about Yeltsin? But he always pronounced it Yelston, like Elston Howard. says, what do we do about Yellowstone? Changed the subject, didn't comment on the story I'd told, and I felt I had done something gross in the middle of the table. So after the lunch, I called someone who knew Nixon. I said, what did I do wrong? He said, I'll find out and I'll call you back, which he did. He said 3 things. Number 1, these days, 1992, Nixon is interested in the future, not the past. Number 2, just in case he felt like talking about the past, 1960 would not be the year he'd like to discuss. And number 3, just in case through some bizarre lapse he wanted to talk about the past and 1960, the place he would really like to discuss would not be Cook County, Illinois, where he feels the election was stolen. So once again, I struck with my elegant sense of personal diplomacy.
And failed to charm
Right.
Richard Nixon. Who do you think among the presidents you've known was the most misunderstood?
Most misunderstood, not a president I've known, but one I've studied, is probably Dwight Eisenhower. And when you were talking about Ronald Reagan, I was thinking a little bit about Eisenhower. And Doug and I are too young to have committed this offense, but a lot of historians in the 1950s, here's to you, Arthur Schlesinger, whom we both admire, but he certainly was one who felt strongly about that, felt that Eisenhower was sort of a dolt and held back progress and did not do much as president, although he was a great general. And once again, talking about the National Archives, go to the Eisenhower Library in the early 1980s, just as you were saying about Reagan's letters. Eisenhower's letters and diaries were being opened, and we historians, even historians who were old enough to have been dubious about Eisenhower, as Arthur was, in the 50s and 60s, realized that Eisenhower was a very smart man, very manipulative, who did a lot of things, and maybe above all else, held down the arms race in the late 1950s in a way that someone without his military experience wouldn't have wanted to and wouldn't have been able to.
And finally, in a few words, which is your favorite presidential library?
My son Cyrus is here in the second row. Cyrus, would you raise your hand? Thank you. I just want to witness here. The way they say, I love my children equally. Well, I love my children equally. I also love my presidential libraries equally. But all that having been said, do you remember my stories about the Kennedy Library and the Johnson Library? I think you'd have to have a heart of stone not to be affected by that. So, love the presidential libraries, love the National Archives, and I am so proud and touched by your all being here this evening. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say it's such a privilege. Michael is my friend, he's my colleague, but you can see now why you have chosen such a superb person to honor tonight by one of the great institutions in our country, in Washington. So.
And also, I was talking about starting at the top. Not everyone gets to have a conversation with Andrea Mitchell on stage, so can we have a hand for her?
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.